It's the state of the dungeon. It's a video that Rob does about his games. Yeah! Hello friends, I am Rob, and here is my State of the Dungeon report. This is for the game that took place on June 24th, 2021. The game was The Princess Bride, the role-playing game. All players were in attendance. The party was in the middle of action. They had just cornered the hunchback servant of the Spanish witch, who they suspected was doing horrible things to not only the son of the Baron, but his friends, the Baron's son's friends as well. They had set up a stakeout outside of the bakery, where one of the sons was in the upper rooms, convalescing. And because of the prescribed treatment, the window had been left open. They knew that this particular victim had not been visited by the assailant, but that the wife of said young man had just departed the room and gone to bed. So they staked the building out for some time until a strange figure moved into their sight and started climbing up the porch, which they decided was the way that a person would be able to get up to that window from the adjacent building. So at this point, One-Eyed Pete sounded the alarm by dropping the bottle that he had been holding as a pretense, appearing to be drunk. And this drew the attention of Manfredi. And at the same time, Bonk and Josie were near at hand, keeping an eye on the situation. And unfortunately, Renoir, who did not trust his stealth skills, was quite a distance away. But as the action started to take place, they quickly started to come onto the scene. And when we started, everyone else was around and waiting to begin action. However, what opened the action was three figures who were working along with the hunchback who stepped out of a dark alley that they had not seen before. This was one man wearing a chain shirt and carrying a long sword, something not commonly seen. And his two minions were a large, strong man with metal-shod knuckles and a thin, dark-skinned fellow who was obsessed with daggers and had lots and lots of them on him. So when the action started off, Manfredi was on the ground next to the building with the porch the hunchback was scaling, because he had asked Bonk to throw him at the hunchback. Bonk did not know where the hunchback was, so he just threw him generally where Manfredi was pointing, which was into the wall. So the others prepared to move up and try to snag the hunchback before he got away. That was one of the more important things on their agenda. To that end, Arnor threw a dagger, but it's dark and he's a small target, and Arnor missed. The dagger-obsessed fellow threw a dagger at Bonk, picking him out as the biggest target, and he hit, but Bonk is very tough, and the dagger didn't do a great deal of damage. The man was dismayed at how little of an effect his thrown dagger had on Bonk. And then the fight really started to take place in earnest. The hunchback was the target of a dagger tossed by Manfredi, who was only feigning that he was in a bad way. And in response, the hunchback lit and dropped a small bomb, like a grenade, at Manfredi. He missed, and Arnor shot across the gap, grabbed the explosive, and with a legendary sleight of hand check, stuffed it into the pocket of the fellow wearing the armor. But due to the unpredictable nature of explosives in the game, it didn't go off for several people's turns, so the fight continued on. The big brute moved over to maul Arnor while he was down. He, didn't appreciate his attempting to throw daggers at his little friend up on the roof. Renoir was moving on to the scene, but he hadn't quite gotten close enough to engage yet. He was looking for something to throw at the Hunchback, which would cause him some problems. So he was looking for a rock or something. So he grabbed what he thought was a rock. It turned out it was an alley cat. And it was not happy with being grabbed. It yowled, hissed, and spit and clung to his arm, raking with its rear claws and basically being very painful and loud. So when he tried to throw the cat didn't want to have any of that and climbed up his arm, took one look at the feather in his hat and shot up onto his hat trying to get the feather. So Renoir is staggering with his cat, running laps around his head, trying to get at his feather, and not actually helping into the fight. But various things happen that eventually the cad with the sword did make an attack against Pete, who had moved up to engage, and Pete took a cut across the chest, but he's now wearing leather armor, and the armor saved him from a point of damage. So he was only scratched. Then the explosive went off. Pete did hurt the big guy, but when the explosive went off, the guy with the armor was blown quite to bits. Well, he was fatally wounded by the explosion. However, all party members managed to make their rolls to avoid any kind of serious injury, even Manfredi, who used the big brute as shelter. So Renoir comes running up the side, and he bounds off the big brute's back, stuffing his hat with the cat on top of his head, and lunges up for the porch roof so he can scale up after the Hunchback. Well, Manfredi thought he would also like to scale up, but he doesn't have great climbing skills, so he started climbing up Renoir's legs. And Renoir's wearing hose, as is a gentlemanly fashion, so he started scaling up his legs. Actually ended up pulling his pants down a ways in an uncomfortable faux pas fashion. And so Manfredi made it up to the roof in a single exchange. Josie moved up to menace the dagger thrower, clipped him a good one. And Arnor was mostly interested in trying to stop anything too bad from happening, but yet did not want to go climbing up after the Hunchback. So Renoir kind of paralleled on the ground and kept an eye on things so that he couldn't get away, or at least do as much as he could to ensure that he didn't get away. Bonk came over and basically, if I remember right, he ended up crushing the big brute and knocking him out. So at this point, there were three folk who were going up. Pete climbed using his native climb skill. He's not the greatest climber. His dice weren't really with him, so he was accomplished enough to climb up to the roof but not give good pursuit right away. Manfredi, as the opportunist, had managed to get up onto the roof and was making some pretty good time. Renoir, who is the most naturally gifted of the lot, eventually got up onto the roof, just as Josie below was clubbed unconscious the dagger thrower and fell the opposition below. She ended up following Arnor around the side of the house where it was most likely that the Hunchback was going to try to escape from. So Renoir began to pursue. As an aerialist, the gap from the porch top to the roof was no problem, and just making a balance roll to run across the slanted roof in pursuit of the Hunchback, that's when disaster struck. His boots slipped and he slid down the roof until his belt caught on the eaves of the roof and left him with a super wedgie dangling off the side of the roof. At this point, he was getting rather cross at fate for continually making him a punchline, despite the fact that he is pretty awesome with his skills. So, Bonk, ever the helpful sort, went over, reached up, and grabbed Renoir's ankles, because he's very tall, and he pushed him back up onto the roof, which didn't make him feel much better, but he felt even worse because at this point Manfredi saw that his leg was dangling over the eaves, so he finished climbing up onto the roof by climbing up his thigh, which got him rather angry. He tried shaking him off, but that didn't work. And Manfredi was running across the roof to try to corner the Hunchback. The Hunchback got to the end of the rooftop, and in case you haven't quite gotten down yet, the bad dice bug had been biting all of us. He tried leaping across the roof, which for him wasn't terribly difficult, but he didn't roll well enough to make a smooth transition, and he ended up going halfway, catching himself on the far roof, but leaving him to dangle over the side. Arnor threw a knife from below and scored a scratch on him, which he did not appreciate. And at this point, things started happening that were kind of strange. Manfredi did not want him to get away, so his idea was to jump, but he wasn't going to try to jump across the roof and confront him. He jumped aiming for the legs of the Hunchback. And he succeeded. He rolled well enough to grab him. Which, of course, his weight added to his own personal weight pulled the Hunchbacked assailant off of the roof, and they both free fall down. However, Josie was there to catch him, and she grabbed at him and basically turned his momentum and slowed him as much as she could. He still hit the ground hard enough to take a scratch, but it was far better than what he otherwise might have been facing. Bonk leisurely tried to catch the Hunchback, but didn't, and he wasn't killed by the fall, but he is badly hurt. So, they have prisoners now. Those who are on the roof climb down. Yes, even Renoir gets to climb down with his dignity somewhat intact. And to be fair, his balance check was penalized by the fact that his pants were down. He didn't bother to pull them up, so he was risking the rating of the show. Or fortunately, he had some small clothes on, so he wasn't flashing everything. But the group got down, and after a very short discussion, decided they were going to bring the vagabonds to justice, at least the ones who hadn't been blown up. Now, the big brute had been felled by Bonk via his wedding club to the small of the back, which broke his spine. So this guy was not likely to be doing anything else productive. So he was down, but the guards were coming because there was a full-scale explosion that had just gone off. So people were curious, of course. So the group decided they were going to leave. Maybe not running away in the dark, but they used the area knowledge of Arnor and Manfredi to slip by the people who were coming to investigate and get back to the castle without being molested, all the while carrying two people, the Hunchback and the Daggerman, on their shoulders. They get to the guard post. There's a little bit of verbal banter because now they're acting suspiciously and carrying unconscious people, and they're not working with the town guard after apprehending some potential criminals. So the guards weren't happy with them, but eventually Manfredi used his interpersonal skills and made it quite clear that they had to be let in. So they got inside. Once they got inside, they basically beelined it to Miracle Max. They now had the Hunchback, and after stripping him of his explosives, and they also found several bottles of a strange sap and a syringe, which pretty much provided all the proof they needed of what was happening here. So they brought them to they brought them to Miracle Max. Miracle Max, they told him the story. He looked at the sap and he's like, "That's Nattern sap. That's something assassins use to waste away opponents." "Yes, well, now that I know what it is, I can fix this." So he immediately went to his work. And they did their thing for a little while until Max got finished. They were discussing everything that they were planning on doing and how to proceed from there when Max came back with a variety of miracle pills that he said would treat the poisoning that they had. So they left and went back to the Baronet's bedroom. While they were there, they saw the Baron, who was pacing in the chambers, as it looks like he had been accustomed to doing. And they're like, well, we can cure him. Where's the witch? And she had vanished. Nobody knew where she had gone. So they went in. Max gave him the pill. He was like, I don't know how long it'll take for him to recover, but he will recover. And almost immediately he opened his eyes and he's like, all right, let's go. But unfortunately his body is wasted after weeks of after all the inactivity. His body is still fairly feeble. So he's going to have to spend some time getting his strength back. In his stead, though, the father, the Baron, offered the army to the group in support of their actions for saving his son. And he wanted those Gilder ruffians out of the neck anyhow. So it was a good activity for the army to do. And they found out that the son had kept the army ready. The second son, who had not really been very strongly considered by everyone else because there was a clear heir. Turns out that he's actually quite competent and dutiful. And he had everything ready to go. So Delric was their point person. And Baronet Delric, as it turned out, was thoughtful to them. He got them horses and asked them to travel along with him as specialists. Gave them a stipend of money, and they set out the next morning. The group did get some rest, and Miracle Max did treat the worst of their injuries, so they got out fairly fresh. So then proceeded some travel time, which was covered by some wonderful establishing shots of New Zealand scenery as they rode through it, because I like New Zealand scenery for movies. And they eventually got to the Neck, which is not delightful and lovely. It is scrubland, and the coast itself is very shallow and has a almost constant bitterly cool breeze coming inward, and the entirety of the Neck is a slow grade, eventually rising up into some hills which serve to frame it from the other side of the hills being a more steep slope, eventually leading down to the Great Lake that covers most of the interior of Florin's eastern side. So the group is following along the trade road, and as they're going along with the army is constantly and competently sending out scouts to make sure they don't get ambushed and to try to find the location of any thieves or the folks from Gilder. The group was kind of getting a little, well, they weren't getting to use their skills because other people were doing it, but they weren't being asked to scout or anything like that. And at this time, they didn't, use any initiative to try to do anything to advance the plot. So they just basically went along with the army and let them do their good work. And while there were a few incidents, eventually one scout came up and gave them news of a massacre. They found a pile of bodies. All of them had been taken by surprise, throats cut, and the bodies were carried off and all left in just a big pile off the road. So the group went up to investigate because some of their skills might have been useful to find out more information about this. What they found out was that this was a merchant of a small, more specialized caravan train that had carted two wagons, as was his custom, and had a variety of guards. Somehow, they had all been killed, despite the fact that those guards are usually pretty cautious and aren't likely to be caught by surprise, but they were. And as a result, all of them were dead, the carts were missing, and no real clues about who had done this. And they tried. They tried looking for clues, but again, the dice were against them. Unfortunately, again, Renoir managed to run afoul of a bear trap, which nailed his leg. It wasn't a very strong bear trap, though. It merely ensnared his leg and Bonk eventually just freed him. He wasn't badly injured from it, as might often happen from a real bear trap. But at this, they basically discovered that whoever did this was a professional. They were very skilled at eliminating people from surprise. So they all pledged to be very cautious. Continued on. There were a few reports that some bandits had been picked up, but there's really not a lot of people who live out here. There's not a lot of trades except for some small olive merchants and olive farmers out in the area, but olives don't require a lot of effort in these climates, so for the most part they just have their shacks and a place to store the olives that they pluck, and they eke out an interesting little living. But there's no neighbors. It takes a certain person to live out in this area. But eventually one guard came back to camp. He had an arrow in him. Ah, action. So the group, as well as the medic of the unit, went up to treat the man, and he was properly treated, and when interrogated, he's like, I was exploring up near the hills, and all of a sudden I felt an impact. I slipped off. The horse spooked because I slipped in an uncomfortable angle for him, and he took me several paces away before I could try to get what strength was left in my limbs to pull him back and point him towards the unit. So it really boiled down to, there's a sniper out there. We need to deal with that. So the group decided they were going to go, and they went without horses out into the scrubby highland or hilly land that was outside. The scrub was broken up. There's lots of area of bare rock and pitted soil that really wasn't very good for horses that weren't trained for rough terrain, as theirs weren't. So they decided the horses were a liability and went off on their own. This proved to be fairly fortuitous, as they didn't have any complications from horses going lame or throwing them or anything like that. Instead, they made their stealth checks and did a fairly good job of sneaking around until they eventually did get a good enough observation roll that they did see one of a sniper. He's dressed in a cloak which camouflaged him very well. He had a long bow and a pair of quivers of arrows, and looked like he was keenly competent. The group decided they were going to move up and deal with this threat. So they move up, and through amazing stealth, Manfredi just ninjas him. He moves up very close, moves in with his dagger, deliberately doesn't kill him with a single blow. Instead, he stabs him in the spine to rob him of his motor control, interrogates him briefly, doesn't get a lot of information out of him other than the fact that their encampment was on the other side of the hills a short distance away, and he had been signaling them using a signaling mirror because he had been seeing the scouts of the army in the hill land below him. And probably at the outskirts of his vision, he could probably even see the army itself. Although the neck is pretty misty and visibility isn't great under almost all circumstances, including this one. So the group now knew where the bad guys were, and they were ready to make their attack. So Renoir decided he was going to run back and attempt to warn the army first and tell them so that they could send the troops up. Also, that these snipers were very good and were armed with quite good weapons. So he was trying to be stealthy. He's not natively very stealthy at all, and passed very close to one of these snipers who saw him and tried shooting him. And his bow snapped, because my dice were terrible too. Snap! Well, Renoir just moved up and gutted him with his sword, because he is very good with his sword. And at this point, he flagged down one of the scouts who was traveling through the area and told him what was going on. And the scout's like, well, it's important that I go back and tell everybody. And he did. So the group went back to the to get together. Renoir joined them again. And they had moved forward until they found a bald hill. And on the other side, they saw a palisade that was made around a fortification. There were a couple of old ruined buildings that they had fortified and restored so that they could use them for their own purposes, and built a few other buildings in the area. But the area gave them a pretty good vantage. They could see anything that was happening out on the lake, unless, of course, weather prevented it. Their place was camouflaged in fairly well, so they couldn't be seen from the lake. And it really only took several strides, and they could be over the hill and looking down below at the neck, being able to see for miles on either side, and being relatively invisible at the same time. It was a good spot for doing the raiding they were doing. So the group took all that in and realized that apparently because of the signals that the advanced archers had given them, there were about 40 to 50 men who were all milling about outside the encampment with bows. And it didn't take them a lot to figure out that they were planning on just stepping over the hill and raining arrow fire on anybody from the army who wanted to come up the hill at them. And through the rough, broken terrain, if these guys knew how to use their bows at all, it was going to be a massacre. Granted, the army had the numbers to weather that kind of an assault. They could make the fight, but it would have cost a lot of men, and the group had a bit of a conscience about this, so they didn't want this to happen. Their idea was to sabotage the camp. The problem being, it had a gatehouse, and there were more people inside yet, and they hadn't even seen the leader yet. Manfredi is nothing if not superbly confident. They now had a cloak from one of these scouts, and they had his bow, they had his arrows. He felt, because he was confident that he could pass as a person of Gilder quite easily, that he could go into their camp. He had a great cover. So they let him go, and he went. And the first time he met their sentries, they asked him for a sign, a prearranged signal to show that he was on their side, which he did not know. So he BS'd his way through, which worked. He just kind of did some non-committal hand gesture that they weren't sure if he was just frustrated and didn't want to do the whole thing or whatever, but they let him go because he rolled rather well. So he got into the camp and started snooping around. He saw the leader of the camp, which is a woman he's aware of, because one of his big purposes for being on this quest is he has to make sure she gets killed. Because she, well, there's reasons. We're not going to go into all the details. But he scoped out the place. He had the explosives from the Hunchback. But the way the camp is arranged, there's a couple of barracks for the men. There's a big pile of loot next to a pavilion where apparently the leader stays. And several large barrels of oil in the middle of the camp, which might burn nicely. But, nothing that's really going to cause the whole place to come down around their ears. It's not very common of a threat in these time periods. A fire would be far more threatening, but he had some ideas. He also found out there's a prison inside the place where several soldiers from the Florin army are. And any of you who might be thinking that's an opportunity, oh, it is. At least two people are interested in the best of the soldiers among their lot, because he is the betrothed of the wandering, well, not betrothed, but the intended of the wandering farmhand, and also the person that Bonk has been looking for because he actually bested him in a wrestling match. So the threads are coming together nicely. So Manfredi was going around and trying to figure out, how he was going to get things done. He had talked to the young man, the soldier who was in the prison, and all he asked for was freedom and a sword, and he would do everything he could to be a distraction. Manfredi realized that was just a death sentence, but something that should be tended to at some point. At this point, the rest of them were kind of getting tired of waiting for him, because they are men of action. Lies do not become them, or something like that. So they debated their options. Arnor was for guile and stealth, of course, and they moved up to a position where they could approach and look at the gate. And unfortunately, this time it was Arnor whose stealth skills were subpar, and some of the sentries noticed that they were being observed, so they went to investigate. At this point, Renoir, knowing this was not going to go well, threw her the cloak and the bow and said, I can't be here, good luck bluffing your way through. Which is kind of, I think, what Arnor felt like comfortable doing. And the others took off into the woods to hide better. Renoir again took distance as his advantage, so he didn't have to roll against his paltry stealth skills. But the others rolled sufficiently to avoid the attention of these guards. Well, Arnor attempted to bluff, but not speaking Gilderese. He could only pull off some pigeon attempt at their language. Still, the Gilder soldiers were even worse. And they knew, the group knows that many of these people are mercenaries who work for Gilder, not necessarily the regular army, they're more specialists, and just had to get convincing enough to get by them. So these irregulars didn't have any kind of checks or passwords or anything, so Arnor was able to bluff his way into the gates to go in. And looking around, Arnor realized quite quickly there's a lot of people still in the camp, even though the number of people getting ready to be archers and pin down the army that will move up the hill to try to get them has now increased to almost 100 men with bows. There's still a number of men left in the camp, and that disguise is not going to last very long, especially the moment Arnor has to open his mouth. So Arnor starts trying to skulk around to get out of the direct notice of everybody, and his suspicious behavior attracts the attention of one of the younger members of the camp, who comes up to have a talk. Now Arnor decides not to try conning or anything, but instead makes the universal shh and shows the money pouch that Arnor is holding and gestures him to come off to a side. When this happens, because Manfredi is inside, he sees this, and he sees Arnor, and is surprised to see Arnor in the camp, and sees this young man moving up. Manfredi has already proven that he is quite capable of eliminating enemies, and pulls out his knife and gets ready to move up. Unfortunately, Manfredi isn't very stealthy, and not this time at least. Just did not roll well, because that's a common theme. So as he's moving up, the guard turns around and looks and sees him coming up with a knife, but he completely blows the intention of what Manfredi is thinking of doing. He thinks there's something dangerous nearby, a snake or something, or maybe something that's crawled up on him that he would need the knife for. So he freaks out and gets stuck by Arnor instead when he turns around. Arnor delivers a wicked blow with the knife. The young man turns around and he gets stabbed again by Manfredi. Not a very powerful blow, however, which allows him to yell. Now, at this point, because things are kind of starting to hasten along, more of the men are coming out in support of the archers. They're going to be up there to help defend in case they get attacked in closer range. And they turn around and they see Manfredi and Arnor and this young soldier of Gilder. And they think, for some reason, because I'm rolling terribly, they read their intent is as they're practicing a scene for Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And they actually yell at them for having bad form with knifing, because they're very good with knifing, as they are departing. So the group doesn't get pinned down on this. So they finally finish off the young man, and they turn around and they get ready to rejoin the group, figure out what's going on. Manfredi has formed a plan. He thinks that he can do some mischief with some of the piles of cloth that the bandits have looted, and there's all the oil off to one side that they could make use of in a destructive way. When the group comes running in, because there's now nobody at the door, they're all assembling up at the northern end of the camp by the hill, where the army looks like they're coming. But there's, as I said, still a large number of Guilder soldiers inside, and all of a sudden, as they come in, they're surrounded. There's all these black-clad Guilder soldiers around them. All of them realize that they've just murdered one of their kind. There may have even been reports of some of these types, but they certainly don't belong here. And there's no room for conning or any kind of sweet-talking their way through. And the leader comes through, and she looks extraordinarily skilled and tough. She and Renoir lock eyes, and Renoir realizes she's the man in black. She's the one who is reputed to be of unparalleled skill up here, and the person that he must fight to prove his skills. There's only the slight problem of the fact that there's an awful lot of Guilder soldiers around. A lot. Far more than they can beat. Which is why at this time they heard the sound of the crashing out of the north, where the army was moving up and they were being met by arrow fire. But behind the Guilderites, at the wall, all of a sudden some people appeared who were climbing over the palisade wall. Pirates. Now you might be asking yourself, why are pirates attacking? Funny story. A side cut, Lady Maybelle and Wicked Bill are trying to figure out where's the richest score they can pull down to get ready for the wedding, because they need plenty of treasure for this wedding. And they realize that the greatest concentration that's easy to be had, possibly, is a group of Guilder raiders, estimated to be about 40 or so men, up at the neck. And wouldn't you know it, they have a boat that would lead them right up to the neck. So, as it turns out, the pirates are attacking at the same time that the group is attacking. And the pirates are now on their side to equalize the odds a little bit against the Guilder soldiers. We have a great fight shaping up with Renoir and the Lady in Black. And all the other things are on the table. Josie is looking around to try to find her beloved, to try to free him. And there's plenty of Guilder soldiers around on tap for them to tangle with. It's going to be a hot bit of time, but the next session should frame the end of the session. And we're hoping that the player who is playing One-Eyed Pete, who missed that entire last segment because he had to leave early for work, we hope that he'll be there because he's a fierce combatant, and it's always more fun when everybody is at the table. So that's what happened for that night of A Princess Bride, the movie. Everything is coming together exactly as I had intended. It was a lot of fun. Even when they were failing, they were having fun and laughing. Everybody has nights like that sometimes. So, next session, we will be wrapping up The Princess Bride. If everything goes right, and even if a few things don't quite go right, will still happen. And then we'll be going into the session 0 for Darkest Dream. So, hopefully you look forward to that as much as I do. And until next time, thanks for joining me. Farewell.